Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months. My mother's voice rang sharp and final, echoing through the hospital room like a judge's gavel. I sat frozen, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled my lungs, but nothing could numb the sharp, twisting pain in my abdomen, or the deeper, colder ache spreading through my chest. It was Christmas Eve at Las Vegas Medical Center. My 2-year-old twins, Oliver and Mia, played quietly in the corner, their small hands clutching stuffed animals, blissfully unaware of the weight pressing down on me. A nurse, Danielle, adjusted my four, throwing me a glance filled with more warmth than I had ever received from the woman on my screen. This is it, I thought. This is the moment I finally know where I stand. My name is Mia Harper. I'm 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been an afterthought. Vanessa, my younger sister, the golden child, could do no wrong. Every achievement, every milestone, every trivial success of hers was celebrated like a royal coronation. Meanwhile, I was the one who was too much, the one who always needed something. And now, apparently, even emergency surgery was too much of an inconvenience. The doctors had found internal bleeding, complications stemming from the stress, the grief, the endless responsibilities that came after my husband Jacob's sudden death 6 months ago. I needed surgery. Tonight. But my parents, they had other priorities. We're retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems, my father had said, his voice laced with irritation, as if I were some persistent telemarketer instead of his daughter begging for help. I felt something inside me crack. For the past 3 years, I had been sending them $2,500 every single month, paying their mortgage, covering their expenses, making sure they lived comfortably while I worked 2 jobs to keep my own children afloat. Even after Jacob died, even when I could barely breathe from grief, I did it because I believed in family. I did it because I thought they loved me. God, how foolish I was. Tears blurred my vision, spilling silently onto the thin hospital blanket draped over my lap. A gentle hand squeezed my shoulder. My friend Natalie is a professional nanny. She specializes in childhood trauma. Let me call her for you, Danielle said softly. Her kindness, so simple, so effortless, shattered something in me. This is what love is supposed to feel like. Not obligation. Not guilt. Not endless, unreciprocated sacrifice. I turned my head slowly, meeting Danielle's eyes. Yes, please call her. And with those 4 words, I made the first real decision of my life. I would cut them off. I would not let my children grow up believing that love was conditional, that they had to earn their worth in someone else's eyes. I would not let them feel what I had felt my entire life. As I ended the call, a flood of memories crashed over me, each one sharper than the last. Graduating college with honors, only for my parents to dismiss it because Vanessa had landed a local commercial. My wedding day, overshadowed by their complaints about the drive to the venue. The birth of my twins, met with a single visit, followed by complaints that babies are too fussy for their liking. Through it all, Jacob had been my rock. We'll build our own family, he used to say, wrapping me in his arms. One that knows how to love. And we had. Until a drunk driver took him away, leaving me to raise our children alone. Even then, I kept supporting my parents. Even then, I sent them money more when they complained about inflation. And even now, sitting in this hospital bed, in agonizing pain, staring at the empty space where unconditional love should have been, they still wouldn't choose me. A deep, shuddering breath filled my lungs. Never again. I had spent my whole life trying to be better than them, to prove that family meant standing by each other no matter what. But the irony was suffocating. Here I was, hooked up to IVs, barely holding it together, bleeding internally, and they couldn't miss a concert to take care of their own grandchildren. Danielle returned, a reassuring smile on her face. Natalie will be here within the hour. She's incredible with kids, used to work with trauma victims at the Children's Hospital before becoming a private nanny. Relief ward with anxiety. How much will this cost? My voice came out weaker than I intended. Medical bills were already piling up. Jacob's life insurance barely covered the essentials, and I was still trying to stay afloat. Danielle squeezed my hand. Don't worry about that right now. Let's just get you through surgery. But I did worry. The number $2,500 flashed in my mind, the money I was scheduled to send my parents next week. Money that could now pay for childcare. Something shifted inside me, something small but undeniable, like an ember catching fire after being cold for too long. When Natalie arrived, she was exactly as Danielle had described. Calm, kind, immediately putting the twins at ease. Oliver, who usually clung to me in new situations, reached for her hand without hesitation. That told me everything. As the hospital staff prepped me for surgery, I knew what I had to do. Danielle, can you bring me my phone one more time? With trembling fingers, I sent 2 messages. The first, to my bank, canceling all automatic transfers to my parents. The second, to my parents. I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Don't contact me again. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, pain clawed at my insides, fear curled around my ribs, but underneath it all, something unexpected bloomed. Freedom. The surgery was successful, but left me weaker than expected. I drifted in and out of consciousness for 5 days, grateful for Natalie, who stayed with the twins at the hospital during the day and took them home at night. During one of my more lucid moments, I noticed my phone blinking with 27 missed calls and a flood of texts. My parents. Vanessa. The pattern was predictable: confusion, then anger, then the inevitable. Desperate pleas about their mortgage. Not once did they ask how my surgery went. Not once did they check on the twins. Then came the final message from my father. You can't just cut us off like this. We've planned a cruise next month, and the tickets are non-refundable. I exhaled sharply, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. That was all I needed to know. Vanessa's messages were different. She sounded genuinely confused. Mom and Dad just told me you had some minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they freaking out about money? I blinked. They had lied to her. Lied to justify their choice, to make themselves look like the victims. Still groggy from medication, I sent her the truth. The hospital stay. The emergency surgery. The moment I begged them for help. Her response came almost immediately. Oh my God, Natasha. I had no idea. They told me you were just being dramatic about a routine checkup. If I'd known, I would have watched the twins. I'm so sorry. I believed her. Vanessa wasn't cruel. Just raised in a house where she was taught that her needs always came first. Maybe this revelation would force her to see our parents for who they really were. By the time I was discharged, I had made several decisions. First, I hired Natalie part-time to help with the twins during my recovery. Second, I contacted a lawyer to draft a will, making sure my children would never end up with my parents if something happened to me. Third, I blocked my parents' numbers. Vanessa remained on the fence, a connection I'd allow for now. The financial impact of my decision was significant. For years, I had sent them $2,500 every month, a third of my income as a graphic designer. Money I had sacrificed, struggled for, lost sleep over. Money I could now use to build a life for me and my children. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was choosing us. Without that financial burden, I could finally breathe. For the first time in years, I could afford proper childcare. Maybe even start rebuilding the emergency fund that had been wiped out after Jacob's death. That night, as I lay in my own bed for the first time since the hospital, the twins sleeping soundly across the hall, a storm of emotions churned inside me. Guilt. That insidious, familiar weight pressing down on my chest. Decades of conditioning telling me I was selfish for choosing myself. Fear. How would I juggle recovery while caring for 2 toddlers? What if this decision left us worse off? But beneath it all, something new was taking root. Self-respect. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was protecting myself and my children, like I should have done long ago. My phone vibrated. Vanessa. I just had a huge fight with Mom and Dad about how they treated you. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Can we talk tomorrow? I stared at the message, the words blurring slightly. Maybe. I wasn't completely alone after all. 2 weeks after surgery, I was slowly regaining my strength. The incision site still ached with every wrong movement, but I was managing. Natalie had been a godsend, arriving each morning to help with the twins while I worked from home. My clients had been patient, understanding my limited availability. Remote work gave me the rare privilege of being close to my children, and for that I was grateful. Vanessa had visited twice, bringing homemade meals and spending time with the twins. At first, our conversations were polite, cautious, like walking on cracked ice. But as the visits continued, something shifted. One evening, as we watched Oliver and Mia build a lopsided tower of blocks, she exhaled heavily. They always made it seem like you were the one distancing yourself from the family. She looked at me then, eyes clouded with realization. I never realized they were pushing you away. Her words settled between us, heavy and raw. I wasn't ready to fully trust her. But I saw something in Vanessa I had never seen before. A flicker of understanding. And then it happened. A knock at the door. I knew who it was before I even looked. Through the peephole I saw them. My parents. My mother clutched her designer purse like a lifeline, her fingers twitching against the leather. My father stood stiff, arms crossed, impatience already carved into his face. I hesitated, heart pounding. Then I opened the door just enough. What do you want? My voice was steady, stronger than I expected. Natasha, darling, we've been so worried. My mother began, her sugary tone triggering every defense mechanism I had. You haven't answered our calls, and we needed to make sure you and the twins were all right. I met her gaze, expression unreadable. We're fine. A pause. Now if that's all. It's not all, my father cut in, his foot shifting slightly forward, pressing against the door. We need to discuss this ridiculous financial situation. The bank called about our mortgage. We had to dip into our cruise savings to cover it. There it was. Not a single question about my recovery. Not one word about their grandchildren. Just money. I told you I was cutting financial ties, I said. I meant it. But sweetie, my mother's voice rose an octave, desperation creeping in. We've come to depend on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us. My commitment? The disbelief hit me like a wave. I sent money out of guilt and obligation, while you couldn't even watch your own grandchildren during my emergency surgery. My father's face darkened. That's not fair, Natasha. We had plans. I felt my pulse spike. Plans more important than my children's safety. More important than my life. Silence. My breath was shaky, but my voice was unwavering. Do you know what the doctor said? There was a chance I wouldn't survive. Did you even bother to ask? The silence stretched. Long. Heavy. Unbearable. Then my mother's whisper. A dramatic, pitiful sigh. We made one mistake. A pause. Are you really going to punish us like this? A slow exhale. Calm. Certain. Final. This isn't punishment, Mom. I met her eyes, watching as my words settled in. This is consequence. For the first time, I wasn't seeking their approval. I wasn't chasing scraps of affection. I was standing my ground. I spent my entire life wanting your support. And in my moment of greatest need, you chose Elton John tickets over me. And that was something I would never forget. We're your parents, my father snapped, his tone sharp, demanding respect. I met his gaze without flinching. And I'm a parent too. But I would never treat Oliver and Mia the way you've treated me. Never. A small shuffle behind me caught my attention. Mia had toddled into the hallway, her stuffed giraffe clutched tightly in one tiny hand. Sleep still lingered in her big, curious eyes as she stared at the strangers at our door. And just like that, my mother's entire demeanor shifted. Oh, there's my precious grandbaby, she cooed, crouching slightly. Grandma brought presents. Mia hesitated, gripping my pajama pants as she pressed her little face against my leg. She didn't know these people. I crouched down, running a hand over her curls. It's okay, sweetheart. Then looking up at my mother, I said, I think you should leave. My voice was quiet but firm. When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll reach out. But the money, my father started, is no longer your concern. And with that, I gently closed the door. The next morning they came back. This time they brought reinforcements. Aunt Brenda, my mother's sister, the self-appointed family peacemaker, who always inserted herself into conflicts under the guise of reason. Natasha, honey, let's be reasonable. Her voice was soft, coaxing, speaking through the closed door I had no intention of opening. Your parents are struggling without your help. I sighed, rubbing my temples. They managed their finances just fine before I started helping them. They chose early retirement knowing their savings weren't enough. Then came my mother's voice, brittle and desperate. We made those decisions because you promised to help us. We had to cancel our cruise, and now we might lose the house. And there it was. The carefully crafted illusion was crumbling. I had never promised them lifetime support. I had offered to help temporarily after they retired early, but over the years that help had mutated into an expectation. A demand. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Mom, Dad, I just had major surgery. I'm caring for 2 toddlers. This conversation is over. I turned away, ignoring their continued knocking, their pleading voices growing fainter as I walked down the hall. By afternoon, I received an email from my father. Not just to me, to the entire extended family. The subject line: Our daughter has abandoned us in our time of need. I skimmed the message, my stomach twisting. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. They painted themselves as helpless, selfless parents who had sacrificed everything for me, only to be cruelly cut off. The email conveniently omitted the part where they refused to watch their own grandchildren during my emergency surgery. But what they didn't anticipate: the backlash. The first reply came from my cousin Adam. Uncle Richard, didn't you just buy a new boat last month? Then came Aunt Rebecca. And Aunt Linda. Wasn't that a new diamond tennis bracelet you were showing off at Thanksgiving? More messages followed. Some were polite, some not so much. But most had the same underlying question. Why are you crying poverty while flashing luxury? Privately, messages trickled into my inbox. Family members, some I hadn't spoken to in years, asking for my side of the story. Even Aunt Brenda called. Her voice was tight, controlled. Natasha, I had no idea about your surgery. They told me you were just being dramatic about some routine checkup. That you were using it as an excuse to punish them financially. I closed my eyes. Of course they had. Meanwhile, Vanessa had fully taken my side. She had seen firsthand what I had endured, and she wasn't letting them twist the truth. Together, we crafted a single response to the family email thread. Short, direct, undeniable. I recently underwent emergency surgery with a significant risk of complications. My parents refused to watch my children during this time because they had concert tickets. I am now focusing on my recovery and caring for my twins without additional stress. I hit send, and that was it. The support that followed was overwhelming. Cousin Adam's wife dropped off home-cooked meals. A second cousin I barely knew offered to babysit for free so I could rest. And most unexpectedly, Danielle from the hospital connected me to a support group for young widowed parents. Their first meeting was on Zoom. I joined from my couch, curled under a blanket, laptop resting on my knees. And for the first time since Jacob's death, I felt understood. Understood in a way only people who had walked the same path could offer. Meanwhile, my parents' situation spiraled. Vanessa uncovered the truth. They weren't just financially struggling. They had been living beyond their means for years. A second mortgage had been taken out a year ago to buy their boat. They had counted on my money continuing forever. And now? Now they were realizing that I wasn't their safety net anymore. They've been lying to everyone, Vanessa said, shaking her head as she flipped through the financial documents they had asked her to review. They're not destitute. They're just overspent. I exhaled slowly, watching Mia stack blocks on the floor while Oliver napped nearby. So if they sold the boat and the timeshare? They'd be fine, she confirmed. More than fine. But they won't. They're acting like selling their luxuries is an impossible sacrifice. Their increasingly frantic texts and voicemails continued, each more desperate than the last. But with every passing day, their hold on me weakened. I was building something new from the ashes of their betrayal. A real support network, one based on mutual care, not obligation. And then, exactly 1 month after my surgery, the twist came. Vanessa called, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. They got a foreclosure notice. I sat up straighter, shifting Mia onto my lap. What? The bank is giving them 60 days to catch up on payments or they'll lose the house. I frowned. What about their retirement funds? A long pause. Then Vanessa sighed. Mostly gone. They spent a chunk on the boat, then Dad put the rest into some scheme his golf buddy pitched him. Lost almost everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. I'm not saying you should help them, Natasha, she added quickly. I just thought you should know. That night, my phone lit up with messages from both parents. Gone was the pretense of concern. Now they were just begging. My mother's message stood out the most. We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We assumed you were just angry and would start sending money again after a week or two. I stared at the screen, a slow burn of rage and clarity rising in my chest. They had never respected my boundaries. Not when I was a child. Not when I begged them for help before my surgery. Not now. And yet, while their world was falling apart, mine was finally coming together. The support group had become more than a place to vent. It was a lifeline. Through them I met Rebecca, a real estate agent whose husband had died of cancer, leaving her with a 3-year-old son. She helped me see possibilities I hadn't even considered. Your apartment's too small, she pointed out one evening. You could sell, use the equity, and move somewhere more affordable. Better childcare options, a fresh start. I had never allowed myself to think that far ahead. And then there was my side business. It had started as something small, a memorial website for Jacob. But soon, others in the support group asked me to design sites for their loved ones. Word spread. For the first time since Jacob's death, I felt something beyond survival. Purpose. And then, as if to remind me how much had changed, my parents showed up unannounced. Again. This time my father carried a spreadsheet. I opened the door, already expecting some grand plea for sympathy. But what I wasn't expecting was desperation. We need $14,000 to catch up on the mortgage, my father said, stepping inside before I could respond. Otherwise, we lose the house. There was no anger in his voice this time. No posturing. Just fear. For a moment I considered sending them away outright. But instead, I gestured toward the dining table. Go ahead. Seat. Not because I owed them anything, but because I was curious. Curious to see if they had changed now that they were truly facing consequences. I glanced at the spreadsheet. Debt, mortgage payments, credit card balances, all spiraling. What about the boat? I asked. My father stiffened. We take a loss. And the timeshare? My mother sighed, shaking her head. We've tried, but the market's terrible. Then quickly, besides, those are our retirement luxuries. I almost laughed. Luxuries, I repeated. That you can't afford. My father's jaw tightened. We could afford them with your help. And there it was. The assumption that I would always be their safety net. That no matter how they mistreated me, I would fix their mistakes. His voice hardened. It's the least you could do after everything we've done for you. Something inside me snapped. I leaned forward, my voice calm but razor sharp. What exactly have you done for me? The silence stretched. And then, at the worst possible moment, Oliver and Mia toddled into the room. Oliver clutched his favorite truck, rolling it along the floor. Mia babbled happily, reaching up for me. And just like that, my parents' expression softened. I knew that look. Not love. Not guilt. Opportunity. And for the first time in my life I didn't fall for it. There are our precious babies, my mother cooed, reaching out for Mia with exaggerated warmth. Mia shrank back instantly, clutching my leg, her little fingers digging into the fabric of my jeans. I rested a protective hand on her head. They don't know you. My voice was quiet but firm. You've seen them, what, 3 times in their lives? That was a choice you made. My father scoffed. That's not fair. We're busy people. I exhaled slowly, keeping my composure. Too busy for your only grandchildren. Too busy to help your daughter through emergency surgery. But not too busy to beg me for money. A sharp silence settled between us. For the first time I saw something flicker in my mother's face. Not just sadness but calculation. She was measuring her next move, choosing between anger and manipulation. Then her face crumpled. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Without your help, we'll lose everything. I held her gaze. I lost my husband. My voice didn't waver. My children lost their father. We survived. You will too. 3 months after my surgery, the inevitable happened. My parents sold the house to avoid foreclosure. Vanessa kept me updated, though I never asked. They had downsized from their 4,000 square foot lakefront property to a modest condo. My father, after months of denial, had finally sold the boat, at a loss. The timeshare, once a symbol of their leisure, had been offloaded for a fraction of what they paid. Vanessa and I sat on my new front porch one afternoon while the twins played in the backyard. "They're actually blaming you for everything," she said, shaking her head. "Telling anyone who'll listen that you abandoned them after promising lifelong support." I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching Oliver chase a butterfly across the yard. Let them talk. And I meant it. For the first time, their words held no power over me. And the truth spoke for itself. My extended family had already chosen sides, and it wasn't theirs. Even my father's sister, who had always defended him in family disputes, called to express her support after learning the full story. Meanwhile, my own life was finally my own. Rebecca, from my support group, had helped me buy a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The mortgage was cheaper than my old rent, and for the first time, the twins had a backyard to call their own. My side business, designing memorial websites, had taken off. What had started as a passion project in Jacob's memory had become meaningful work, allowing me to cut back on my old graphic design clients. Natalie still helped with childcare 3 days a week, but I'd restructured my life to maximize time with my kids. And most importantly, I had found my people. Neighbors welcomed us with casseroles. The support group organized playdates. Vanessa had stopped being a competitor for our parents' affection and had become a real sister. Even Danielle, the nurse who had first shown me kindness that night in the hospital, occasionally stopped by with her own children. I had lost my husband. I had cut ties with my parents. And yet I had never felt less alone. 6 months after my surgery, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. A handwritten letter from my mother. I nearly threw it away, but curiosity won out. Inside was something I had never seen before. A real apology. "I've had time to reflect on my behavior," she wrote. "Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to confront some painful truths about myself as a mother. I was jealous of your independence, your resilience. I resented that you didn't seem to need me the way I needed my own mother. But now I see that you did need me, just not in the ways I wanted to be needed. When you asked us to care for the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out, and we failed you completely. I'm deeply sorry." I read the words twice, 3 times. The letter continued, explaining how they had finally restructured their finances. My father had even taken a part-time job at a hardware store. I folded the letter carefully, setting it aside. I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. But for the first time in my life, my mother wasn't making excuses. She was owning her failures. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. They had sold most of their luxury items, downsized their lives, and for the first time in decades, were learning what it meant to live modestly. But in my mother's letter, she hadn't asked for money. She hadn't even asked for forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. I showed the letter to Vanessa, watching her expression shift between skepticism and something softer. "They've been talking about writing to you for weeks," she admitted. "Dad was against it at first, but I think he's starting to see things differently too. Especially after his heart scare last month." I stiffened. "Heart scare? Just high blood pressure and chest pains," she reassured me. "But it rattled him. He's on medication now. Actually following the doctor's orders for once." She hesitated before adding, "I think facing mortality has humbled him a bit." I sat with that information, unsure of how to feel. A part of me, the part conditioned to care, to rush in, to fix, felt the familiar pull of concern. But another part, the part that had fought so hard to break free, whispered, "Be careful." I wasn't ready to respond. Not yet. Was this real remorse? Or just another carefully crafted act? Another shift in strategy now that their old ways no longer worked? That night, for the first time since cutting ties, I dug out old family photos. Behind the polished smiles and staged moments, I saw the patterns I had once been blind to. My parents had always been performers, playing the role of devoted parents, generous providers, while always putting themselves first. I couldn't let nostalgia cloud my judgment, so I gave myself time. And a year after my surgery, I finally agreed to meet them. We chose a neutral location, a quiet cafe near my new home. When they arrived, I barely recognized them. My father, once so sure of himself, seemed smaller. His usual air of authority had been replaced by something quieter, humbler. My mother's usual designer wardrobe had been traded for simple, practical clothes.
No flashy jewelry.
No polished performance. Still, I wasn't ready for a family reunion. The twins were with Vanessa for the afternoon. This was about them and me. We sat in awkward silence until my father did something I had never seen before. He cried. His voice broke as he spoke. I've been a terrible father. He exhaled shakily. And an even worse grandfather. He didn't make excuses. I don't expect your forgiveness, he continued. But I want you to know. I see it now. How selfish we've been. My mother reached across the table, not quite touching my hand but close. We've spent months in family therapy, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. It was Vanessa's idea. We resisted at first, but it's been transformative. For the first time, they weren't defending themselves. They weren't blaming me. They were simply owning what they had done. And I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't rush to fix or forgive. Instead, I showed them pictures of the twins, told them about our new life. And they listened. Not to respond, not to twist the narrative, but to understand. As we stood to leave, my father hesitated before asking, would it be possible someday to know our grandchildren? I met his gaze, considering my answer carefully. That depends on your actions, not your words. A pause. If you're genuinely committed to change, we can start with short, supervised visits. But understand this, my children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother. They both nodded, no protests, no pushback. As I walked away from that meeting, I expected to feel something heavy, the familiar weight of obligation, or maybe the old anger simmering beneath the surface. But instead I felt something entirely new. Calm. The calm of a woman who knew her worth, who had created boundaries, and would enforce them without apology. Whether my parents could truly change remained to be seen. But I already had. I was no longer a daughter desperate for approval. I was a mother, fierce in my protection, clear in my expectations, and finally at peace with whatever came next.